All right, let's jump right in. Today, we are analyzing the era of transoceanic connections, a period that didn't just change the world, it fundamentally rewired it. We're going to break this whole era down into a really clear chain of cause and effect. We'll start with the technology that made it all possible and trace that chain all the way to the new societies it created. By the end of this, you will be able to explain exactly how these interconnections laid the foundation for the modern, globalized world we live in.
So, here is our plan. We'll start with the technological spark, then dig into the causes of exploration. From there, we'll hit the most dramatic consequence, the Columbian Exchange, which, of course, led to maritime empires. And finally, we'll look at how people pushed back against this new power and the new social hierarchies that locked it all in place. You'll see, it's a logical flow from how to why to so what.
Okay, first things first, let's get into that first link in our causal chain. Before anyone could even dream of sailing across a vast ocean, they needed the right tools. This whole section is about the critical tech that had to be in place to make long-distance sea travel even a remote possibility. Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand that European innovation did not happen in a vacuum, not at all. It was a direct result of something we call cross-cultural diffusion. Essentially, Europeans were borrowing, blending, and improving on technologies that were already out there in Afro-Eurasia. Think about it. You've got the magnetic compass from China, the lateen sail, which was perfected in the Indian Ocean, and these incredibly advanced astronomical charts from the Islamic world. Without all this shared knowledge flowing together, the age of exploration simply doesn't happen.
So, this new knowledge gets put to work to solve very specific problems. Shipbuilders began engineering these new vessels, each one like a specialized tool for a different job. You had the Portuguese caravel, small, zippy, perfect for exploring tricky coastlines. Then you get the larger carrack and, my favorite, the super-efficient Dutch flute, which were basically just giant floating cargo containers. They were all designed to make transoceanic trade not just possible, but incredibly profitable. Each ship was a tool built for a specific imperial goal.
All right, let's build on that. Now that we've established that Europeans could sail across oceans, we have to ask the big historical question. Why did they? I mean, what motivated states to pour massive amounts of money and resources into these incredibly dangerous voyages?
The classic framework here, and it's a classic for a reason, is God, gold, and glory. Gold is the economic piece, the burning desire to cut out the middlemen and get direct sea routes to those valuable Asian spices. God, well, that was the religious drive to spread Christianity. And glory was all about raw state power, that intense keeping up with the Joneses rivalry between monarchies like Portugal and Spain to claim more land and build a bigger empire than the other guy.
And that gold motivation was supercharged by this powerful economic theory, mercantilism. Now, mercantilism basically saw the world's wealth, measured in gold and silver, as a fixed pie. There's only so much to go around. So for your nation to get a bigger slice, you had to make sure someone else's slice got smaller. It created this intense, zero-sum game for global power. And colonies? They became the most important pieces on the chessboard, providing cheap raw materials and captive markets. Under mercantilism, having colonies wasn't just a good idea, it was a state-level economic necessity.
Okay, time to put your thinking caps on. Pause this explainer right now and write a single-sentence thesis statement. I want you to argue which of the three G's, God, gold, or glory, was the primary driver of state-sponsored maritime exploration. Go ahead, hit pause. Okay, welcome back. A strong thesis might sound something like this. While religious fervor and national competition were significant factors, the economic imperatives of mercantilism ultimately provided the most powerful and sustained motivation for European states to fund transoceanic voyages.
So, the technology is in place, and the motivation is crystal clear. So what happens when these voyages finally connect two hemispheres that have been totally separate for millennia? Well, you get a collision. The result is the Columbian Exchange, an unprecedented biological and cultural transfer that literally changed the world forever. Now, while this was a two-way street, the impacts were profoundly unequal. From the Old World, Afro-Eurasia, came transformative animals like the horse and, of course, devastating diseases like smallpox. From the New World, the Americas, came calorie-packed foods like potatoes and maize that led to massive population booms back in Europe and Asia. This exchange permanently reshaped diets, environments, economies, and cultures on a truly global scale. But the single most catastrophic effect of this exchange was demographic. The unintentional transfer of diseases, pathogens like smallpox and measles, from Europeans and Africans to indigenous Americans who had zero immunity was, well, it was an apocalypse. It led to a population decline of up to, and in some cases more than, 90%. This is, without a doubt, the greatest demographic disaster in human history. It's a point we have to sit with.
So in the wake of this demographic collapse, how did European states capitalize on these new connections? Let's move on and see how they forged these massive, overseas maritime empires, creating entirely new economic and labor systems designed specifically to extract wealth from the Americas. And the development of these empires really follows a clear pattern. Portugal kicks things off early, creating a trading post empire in Africa and Asia. Spain follows with its massive land-based empire in the Americas after 1492. And then, seeing their rivals get rich, other powers like the Dutch, the French, and the British all jump into the game, sparking this intense, worldwide competition to build their own maritime empires.
To make these empires pay, Europeans implemented new and incredibly brutal systems of coerced labor. It started with the Spanish encomienda system, which was basically a grant of indigenous labor to a Spanish conquistador. As that system broke down, it evolved into the hacienda system, a form of debt peonage on huge agricultural estates. But as indigenous populations plummeted from disease and the demand for labor on sugar plantations exploded, Europeans turned to the transatlantic slave trade, creating the horrific system of chattel slavery, where human beings were treated as actual property. But wait, how do you even pay for these massive, risky, and hugely expensive imperial projects? The answer is a brilliant new financial innovation, the joint stock company. By selling shares to private investors, rulers and merchants could pull together enormous amounts of money to fund voyages and build colonies, all while spreading out the individual risk. It was the perfect financial tool for the age of mercantilism.
Okay, let's pause again for a quick self-check. I want you to think for a second, how did systems like chattel slavery and institutions like the joint stock company directly serve those core goals of mercantilism we talked about? Pause the explainer and try to connect those dots. Right. The connection is direct and powerful. Coerced labor systems extracted raw materials like sugar and silver for almost no cost. Joint stock companies then managed the trade of these goods. And where did all the profit go? Straight into the treasury of the European mother country, which is the absolute definition of mercantilism in action.
But it would be a huge mistake to think this was a one-way street of European domination. Imperial power was never absolute. The expansion of these new maritime states was met with constant, creative, and fierce challenges. So now we're going to shift the narrative to focus on how local and enslaved populations resisted this new state power. And this resistance took so many different forms. You had direct, armed uprisings, like the Pueblo revolts, that successfully kicked the Spanish out of New Mexico for over a decade. You had resistance from savvy rulers, like Queen Anazinga in Central Africa, who skillfully played European powers against each other for decades. And you had the constant, determined resistance of enslaved people, who escaped bondage and formed their own free communities, known as Maroon societies. The key takeaway? Imperial control was always contested.
All right, our final section. Let's look at the long-term social consequences. The mixing of all these diverse peoples, Europeans, Africans, and indigenous Americans, led to the creation of entirely new social structures, and these structures were often explicitly based on race and ethnicity, designed from the ground up to maintain the power of the colonizers.
The casta system in Spanish America is the textbook example of this. It was a deeply complex and rigid racial hierarchy built to keep colonial power in place. At the very top, you had the Peninsulares, people actually born in Spain. Just below them, Creoles, people of European blood but born in the Americas. Then you had this whole spectrum of mixed-race categories, like mestizos and mulattoes. And way down at the bottom of this pyramid were indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. Your spot in this system determined everything about your life.
This quote from the course description really hits the nail on the head. The whole process of conquest and colonization was engineered to create and support new elites, like the Peninsulares and Creoles, who got rich off this new global economic system, usually at the direct expense of everyone else. These social structures weren't an accident. They were a tool of imperial power.
So, let's wrap this up. Let's recap the key takeaways. We've traced a clear causal chain, right? Borrowed technology from Afro-Eurasia made exploration possible. That exploration was driven by mercantilist greed.
This led to the world-changing Columbian Exchange and the creation of huge maritime empires built on coerced labor. These empires then created new racial hierarchies to stay in control, but their power was always met with resistance.
Okay, here's your final self-assessment, and it's a big one. Can you connect the very first link in our chain to the absolute last one? Pause the explainer and actually try to explain the causal link between a piece of tech like the caravel and a social hierarchy like the Costa system. Seriously, this kind of long-term causal thinking is exactly what you need to master for the AP exam.
And this brings us to our final thought. This period, from 1450 to 1750, isn't just dusty old history. The trade